I'm a huge fan of STS for so many reasons. We try to change systems. We try to design systems from the ground up. Systems also change us, and systems also sort of co-design our set of possibilities and our set of possible worlds.
Hello, and welcome back to Eclectic Spacewalk. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay. Today on Conversations, we are joined by Fred Scharmen. Fred is an associate professor and program director of graduate architecture in the Department of Graduate Built Environment Studies in the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University. Fred is also the co-founder of Brick Moon and the author of Space Forces and Space Settlements. We had a fantastic talk about design, space architecture, speculative futures, and bringing a critical perspective to the overview effect. Now, before we play the episode, I would ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and reach more people, as well as continue to have more interesting discussions with eclectic guests. Also, tell us in the comments what your favorite part of the talk was and who we should invite on next. Now, on to the conversation. What can you say your earliest interests were? Like, what were you the most curious about when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah. Well, my field right now is architecture and urban design. And I got into that sort of by way of being a kid who was obsessed with the future and
Okay.
what kind of spaces and things we would make in the future. And for me, finding out about the field of design was a way to sort of directly connect that early kind of impulse about like the future is cool and interesting and exciting to an actual profession that people practice every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so as somebody who was into thinking about the future, I found a lot of resonances in bringing those areas of interest back to architecture and urban design, back to sort of my home fields, because it's what we do. It keeps us excited about the things that we do and the work that we put in every single day, because we're, in one sense, in a mundane sense, people who design buildings are sitting there drafting or making phone calls. But what you're really doing is building a new world. You're making a new world, and you're thinking about what that world should include in it and what it should be like. So an early excitement, and interest in space science and the kind of futures that organizations like NASA or science fiction culture was showing us that could be possible, really for me connected directly into the field that I'm in now.
That's really cool. And so I'm assuming we'll get into some of these other maybe science fiction, other kind of speculative fiction kind of things as we go on in our conversation. But was there maybe certain authors or certain kind of things that were drawing you? Was it maybe more TV, film? Was it books? What kind of really sparked your interest first?
Yeah, I mean, I looking back, and these are the kinds of things you track down later from like used bookstores online and stuff. And
Sure.
sometimes these things are either like, oh, it costs $2, or sometimes it's like, oh, that costs $245. But some of the things I have on my shelf right now that I've had one form or another since I was a kid are things like the Oosborne Book of the Future,
Okay.
which I think came out of the UK originally. And in the late 70s, early 80s, these were books that were showing us things like robots, video watches, solar panels, high-speed maglev trains in vacuum tunnels, living in Antarctica or living on the moon, living in space. Really heavily, like richly illustrated books that you could just sit on the floor and flip through and get lost in for hours.
Wow.
And the American version of that it wasn't a direct spin-off of the Whole Earth catalog, but it was a book that was inspired by the Whole Earth catalog, a book called The Kids' Whole Future Catalog, that was a broad compendium, with references to learn more, on your next trip to the library.
Oh, cool.
It was a broad collection of the existing state of the art. And again, the late 70s, early 80s, when I would have been about, 5 or 6 years old. The existing state of the art for all those technologies that that we were told, our generation was told were going to define our future. And my parents were both ex-hippies, So they had this kind of impulse to collect these books and things that were part of the more eclectic, counterculture inflected
Oh, that's great.
um, areas of knowledge. And so I didn't know that that was a little bit unusual at the time. I just flipped through the books that were put in front of me. But once I started seeing like these kinds of things, especially, these illustrations,
Mm.
that sell the idea, that depict the world and really kind of make the case for how compelling these spaces and these objects are going to be. That was a real sort of takeoff point for me.
That's so cool because honestly, I was thinking back. The first thing that came to my mind was when I was growing up with these kind of picture books where you open them up and then there would be like a castle, but then there would be like a cut, in the
Oh
castle, and
yeah.
so you can
Mm-hmm.
like see inside and the design. And that was always kind of very cool to me. Yeah, so I guess then the best formulation to continue on this thread is like kind of walk us through your academic journey to now, or kind of what were you doing? Maybe you did you do some special internships or kind of get in? Was it kind of a snowballing into this design, or was it kind of a eureka moment? Like how did you get to? And then we'll go into your professorship. So how kind of up until now, what has been your journey?
Yeah, I mean, this is another moment where I was lucky and it was productive to remember that I could connect like this early stuff with the real world today. When
Okay.
I got an interest in teaching. I spent a lot of time working in different aspects of the profession of architecture.
Okay.
My dad was a carpenter, so
Ah.
we always had that, that sort of hands-on background in our family. And but at a certain point, I had the opportunity to teach part-time while I was working in an office, working for an architecture firm.
Mm-hmm.
And that really got me excited because people, students, especially in the early parts of their education, are asking like really basic questions that have like really profound answers. Like, how do you make decisions about, how space should be organized?
Right.
And so you have to ask them yourself, and these things that you've taken for granted in your practice and building stuff and drawing stuff, you have to now re-examine and go, okay, well, what is important about that? What is interesting about that?
Mm-hmm.
So, in getting more involved with teaching, I had the chance to apply for more full-time tenure track positions, and I made the choice to sort of take my design aspirations and bracket them a little bit, limit them a little bit. Instead of being primarily a designer who taught a little bit, I was now have the chance to become primarily a teacher who designed a little bit.
Ooh, cool.
And one of the things that I, naively discovered that in university education, what administrators will ask you is, well, what are your research interests? For
Mm,
because of course we're expected to teach, we're expected to perform service to the community, and the third
sure.
pillar is research and the production of new knowledge. And that was another aha moment for me because I said, well, I think I can go back and figure out. I want to figure out what all this stuff was about. I want to figure out what's behind the cool, compelling rendering or painting of a city in space and find out, connect to those basic questions of like, how do we design, how and why do we design it this way instead of this other way? So to link up these basic questions about like, how do we organize human life in a space, in any space, like the
Mm-hmm.
spaces that we're occupying right now, and how and why is this part of that conversation? So
Mm,
this stuff, I think, and part of my kind of my bigger agenda over the past 7 years, when I've had the chance to follow these paths and go and figure out like, okay, what was up with that? What was up with that crazy rendering that was in this book that I find in my parents' bookshelf when I'm 5? Um, Often the answer is, well, there are all these clear connections to the mainstream of design culture, of the histories of architecture and urban design that my discipline thinks are kind of more or less self-contained, right? No, it leaks
mm-hmm.
out,
Mm-hmm.
and there's all these conversations going on between science fiction and design history
Yep.
that go in both directions. Speculative practices learn from real practices, and vice versa. So that's been kind of the overall theme
Mm-hmm.
to the kind of work that I like to do best lately,
Okay.
is to tell people in architecture and urban design, hey, you should be interested in this stuff. Don't just put it in a box and call it genre and ignore it. It's
Right.
related to what we do. And then at the same time, to talk to people in space science and science fiction and say, hey, you can also learn from all these other disciplines that have been thinking about the future and thinking about space and culture for a long time. And to make that connection has been really cool.
Oh, that's great. And then, so I guess this will be a good segue into your professorship, I guess, and your programs. But but right before we get to that, when you were bringing this up, it really reminded me of, and this is kind of interesting and timely, is that for a research paper I had to do this past year for this thing called Great Debates, there was one paper called Epistemic Activism by Amy Hamraoui, basically design expertise as a site of intervention. And so it
Yeah.
talked about Ronald Mace, basically being this disabled kind of architect, couldn't even get into a school program, but then basically said, I don't care, I'm just going to go be it. And then he became this like famous architect, and then he influenced a bunch of generations and stuff like that. So basically going up the I guess you could say upstream, as you could say. So in that kind of regard of like how do access is a huge deal nowadays. It's more so maybe than historical. So I just thought of that in her book, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability. So like, how do you think about not just like access, because that's one lens or one kind of type of thinking, but how do you kind of incorporate multiple, I guess you could say, a multiple kind of interests and value systems, et cetera, into design? Because I'm assuming that's a tall task at face value. And then we can kind of maybe get into your professorship. So I didn't know if that resonates with you, if you have things to talk about, but that just kind of came to thought.
Oh, totally. I mean, I'm fascinated by the history of legislation, things like the Americans with Disabilities Act.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
That upstream, the sort of upstream practices that you're talking about is a great way to frame it. That's a nice framing. You think about activists climbing the steps of the Supreme Court, getting out of wheelchairs and demonstrating with
Yep.
their bodies the way that the organization of the space conditions and allows a certain kind of person to be invited in and a certain kind of person to be excluded. And also the image of activists taking jackhammers to sidewalks to make their own literal curb cuts.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
To cut into the curb, and to directly engage with, like, okay, well, who gets to make space? It's not just municipalities and civil engineers and the legislation that they use as their tools. It's me with my jackhammer, and I'm going to make this space into something that allows for a different kind of use than it had originally been intended. And in my teaching, I'm very lucky to have the opportunity to teach at one of America's HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and they're all we are 155 years old this year, Morgan State University in Baltimore. And that 155-year point, of course, reaches back to the end of the Civil War and the American Reconstruction, when we had this moment in history where people who didn't have access to higher education all of a sudden started to have new opportunities to gain that access. So when I think about access to space, it means all those things at once, right? It means, like, who gets to cross the street and be able to use a public space like a sidewalk. It means who gets to have a higher education, who gets to have access to the space of higher education. It also means access to the future. It means access to the new spaces that humans will inevitably make in our future worlds. And foregrounding that question of access has been, I hope for me, a really strong and it's been a very productive theme, in my own work. Whenever I ask those kinds of questions to primary material, whenever I bring those kinds of questions to primary material, you tend to get interesting answers, because embedded in the design of new worlds are sometimes, explicit, but more often implicit ideas about who they are for. So making sure that we are explicitly answering that question with as broad a category, as possible, has been a really kind of useful tool in the toolkit that I feel like I'm starting to gather.
That's great. And well, awesome to hear. And so I guess let's go into a little bit more depth of your actual professorship. So you're the associate professor and program director of graduate architecture, Department of Graduate Built Environment Studies in the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University. So like how I mean, in STS and science technology studies, like that's one of the biggest things of the materiality of things and how values
Yeah.
are hard coded inside of technologies and certain affordances, deaffordances. So I guess moving past thinking in terms of access, et cetera, what do you, how do you get people to kind of think a little bit more in terms of, I don't know, sociocultural, sociopolitical, these kind of bigger kind of themes in design in your teaching, and then maybe just talk us through some of the classes that you teach, or some how do you kind of go about doing this? Because again, being a head of a department is one thing, but then also being a head of a department, as you said, as a HBSC, then I think that you probably have some interesting kind of tidbits, not just to say about your profession, but then also, again, the space that you're located within, which is quite interesting in Baltimore.
Well, I've learned so much from your colleagues in anthropology and science and technology
Yeah.
studies. And I'm a huge fan of STS for so many reasons. I
Yeah.
appreciate just the generosity of the practice of the
Mm-hmm.
that's inherent in the approach that you all use, that you all bring to the things that you study, and also the of course the kinds of questions that you all ask that focus on, okay, what's the stuff, who's in the room, what are they bringing, what kind of backgrounds do they have.
Yeah.
My friend and colleague Lisa Masseri, who's an anthropologist in STS, she likes to say who makes, and I'll paraphrase, and forgive me Lisa for getting it wrong, but who makes the spaces in which spaces are made, and kind of
Ooh,
building
love
on
it.
questions that Donna Haraway and others
Yeah, of
ask.
course. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's really important to to understand where you're from, right? And
Mm-hmm.
understand and then where you're at. And so being at a place like Morgan, in a place like Baltimore, is a really great place. It's a really great set of rooms in which to make the future. And I like
Sure.
to think that's that kind of practice and centering those kinds of awarenesses, is central to what we do. We had, and for example, in the 2020 kind of iteration of the Black Lives Matter
Oh,
moment,
huh?
when these conversations came to the forefront, we had a lot of people from other universities asking, like, okay, how do we decolonize our curriculum? How do we think about, we've been thinking about form, but how do we integrate conversations about justice, spatial justice, into conversations about space and form? And Morgan is a place where we've been having those conversations for a long, long
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about explicitly, and for example, my urban design class, questions about the historical reasons for why Baltimore is the way it is, right? We can
Mm-hmm.
still read patterns of redlining and systemic disinvestment in current demographics
Yeah.
today, right? If you superimpose the red line map on the map of, say, life expectancy at birth by zip code, it's the same map, right? So these questions are spatial questions. Integration and segregation are spatial practices, and understanding that a place like an HBCU, to talk about spatial justice and race,
Mm-hmm.
brings a lot of inherent histories. Most
Oh,
HBCUs were integrated before Brown versus Board of Education. HBCUs invited white students in before white institutions invited Black students,
wow.
which I think is a fascinating aspect of institutional history.
Yeah.
I'm aware every day, as a white academic teaching at an HBCU, that this is a place that's not designed to center people who look like me, and yet I am a valued guest in the space. And I think that's an important kind of experience that a lot of people could benefit from. In my environmental controls class, we talk about things like how and why is the air designed the way it
Mm-hmm.
is, right? We take for granted in architecture that, okay, we design, what the wall's made of, we design the dimensions and sizes and shapes of things, but we also design things like the air, like the surface of the ground, for example, and does that include or exclude certain people by design. There's a there are so many there's so many ways into the question of who the space is for that I think architecture as a discipline sometimes forgets and sometimes remembers. And it's great that we're in a moment where my discipline is interested in actively remembering. But places like HBCUs are important for so many reasons. Not the least, there are places where if you want to know, where that conversation has been going on, come here, and talk with us and ask questions and listen, because it might be new to you, or it might be being remembered, by certain aspects of the discipline or by institutions. But some people never forgot, and some places you can't forget.
So I guess my follow-up question for some of that would be not to, I mean, you're definitely doing some epistemic activism in kind of the spaces and stuff, but I guess my question for you would be a little bit more personal, and like, how do you see, or what do you get out of kind of teaching the future? Because if we're designing for the future, but then you're also molding minds in the future, like, I don't know if you have any specific things of like, do you just love teaching, or is it just kind of a thing to have? And then you kind of found a great opportunity in Morgan State? Because I think for a lot of people, at least academics, the professorship is really, I wouldn't say a calling, but there are people who like enjoy it for just the teaching aspect of the molding of the minds, et cetera. And I don't know if you kind of fall along that camp, because the next question would be some of your other work, the working group on adaptive systems and things like that. So I guess we'll wait for a second, but what are kind of your thoughts on just teaching and molding specific, society minds, not just places and et cetera?
Well, for me, it goes back to the question of concreteness. It's I like design education specifically because there are always things in the space to point to, right? I'm here just with blank white background because I haven't cleaned up the other half of my office, but we're in very specific spaces with tons of examples to discuss. And what I think, what is the core of my teaching practice is being able to remind students and to sort of unlock within them the sense that somebody made everything in your field of view and in the space that you're occupying. It's not inevitable like the weather. It didn't happen due to, strange cosmic forces beyond our control and understanding, right? There are reasons why certain decisions were made, and certain decisions could have gone otherwise.
Yeah.
And that practice, happened in a room with specific people, right? Again, specificity and concreteness come into play, and you will be able to be in that room. You should be in that room, right? That is the core of my practice, is to look around and say everything that exists was made. It was made by means of specific decisions and relationships and intentions and limitations. You can participate in that process, and you should. The process needs you to participate in it, because if you don't, someone else will.
Yep.
So that's been the core of my. I don't swing hammers or frame buildings, or not the least, I don't jackhammer sidewalks, and I'm very grateful for the people who do that. But the methodology of teaching is to remember that those people who do, matter, and that you can be one of them. And I think that's really, really important. And that's something that I center in design studio and in the seminars that I teach. I think I teach in seminars. I teach beginning design studio, so design studio for graduate students who are coming in with like no background in design. But I also teach at two scales. I teach urban design, at the bigger sort of scale, and environmental controls, which is like building systems and lighting, sound. So it's like the scale of the room and the scale of the city.
Oh, very cool.
And it's great to be able to work with the same students at all those multiple scales, and to talk about how they all interrelate and connect, and how they are all the way they are because of specific human decisions and human relationships.
Yep.
And that you need to be a part of that system. You need to be a part of those relationships and conversations and decision-making processes.
Well said. So I guess moving on from like academia and teaching and stuff, that was super cool, because now I'm kind of thinking of some other stuff, but I'll wait till the other parts. But so let's talk quickly about the working group on adaptive systems. I thought this was so interesting, cool on your website. So, quote, the working group on adaptive systems is an art, design, and research consultancy based in Baltimore, Maryland. We are interested in cities, spaces, people, and the things that connect them to each other and to the larger world. So very much when we were just kind of talking about. And so I guess I'll just pick three that I really kind of felt, and then maybe we can go from there. So first and foremost, obviously with the space and Donna Haraway and all the rest of it, the non-human autonomous space agency. Thought that was super interesting of sorts. There's been plenty of animals that have gone up into space via NASA, Cosmodrome, et cetera. But the non-human autonomous space agency. Tell us first, I guess, a little bit about the working group and adaptive systems, and then kind of these other projects that you might want to go a little deeper. The second and third one was the Evergreen Commons. Loved that, and then also mapping and master planning. Again, kind of so that kind of cutesy, et cetera. But then the Evergreen Commons and the master plan mapping and master planning was super interesting in terms of policy, governance, et cetera. So maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's some deep cuts. I like it. So the working group on adaptive systems broadly has been sort of my kind of venue in which I get to play with others.
Yeah.
And that means
Cool.
people, that means it's the funny thing, this private joke in calling it the working group is really just me. But with every project, I bring in other people and collaborate with people from other disciplines, with artists, with writers, with
Cool.
people in anthropology and sociology. It's a chance to play with others, and whatever the outcome is, they can call it something completely different, right? I mean, they might have a completely different agenda for the project, or even a different title or something like that. So it's a venue in which collaboration can be centralized, because it's always me plus others. And so for things like Evergreen Commons, one of the things, with three primary collaborators that worked on that project, myself and my friends Eric Lashinsky and Ryan Patterson. Ryan Patterson works in public art and arts administration. Eric is an artist and a planner. And what we wanted to do, we had the opportunity to work on an 18th century, the grounds of an 18th century mansion that has this sculpture biennale, of course, every 2 years. So we were commissioned to propose a project for that. What we wanted to do was immediately sort of pass the baton to other people. We wanted to make a platform for other people to come and participate. So we didn't keep any of the money. We actually lost a ton of money building what we built, which was the sort of framework of an urban public space. Mm-hmm. So it was a hardscape in this lush green fields on the grounds of the historic estate. We built a piece of the city. We built a sort of harder, grittier place that people could just hang out in, with a basketball hoop, with benches, with trash cans and things like that, chain link fence. And we invited other people to do installations and events in that space as a platform. So we had things like the artist Sarah Doherty, who's casting Cabbage Patch Kids into concrete and making planters and all kinds of strange and interesting public monuments as part of her practice. So she came in and did work. We had Gary Cacciadorian, who's an artist who reproduces textures and patterns at scale. He sort of draws them really small and then he blows them up on a Xerox machine back to full scale.
Oh, whoa.
So he made us a cinder block wall, but it was it was a Xerox drawing of the cinder block wall made of 8.5 by 11. That's then, the size of a real cinder block wall. So it's a chance to, again, play with others and help in the co-production of a kind of world where you're giving away some of those resources and control and specificity and saying okay, let's see what's possible, or let's just all get together and make the space ourselves, as a group. And then with something like the non-human autonomous space agency, that was a point in my own research about space cities and the future of human space habitation, where I wanted to step back from research and act again as a designer and say, okay, well, I'm reading and writing and interviewing people about these big rotating habitats in space in the future. Hey, Fred, you're a designer too. Why don't you design one of these things? Right, so immediately that question of who who gets to go
Yeah.
comes into the
Yeah.
forefront. And I wanted to center the things that people do really get excited about, which is like Leica. If you say the word Leica, anywhere globally, right? We understand, okay, that's the
Camera.
cute little dog that the Russians launched into space. Literally the first Earthling in space
Oh,
was a
yes.
dog from the
Yep.
streets of Moscow. Um, and she was on ceramics. She was on, it was in the newspaper. It's a very sad story because they didn't plan for her to survive the return to
Yeah.
Earth.
Whoops.
But we hold that at bay for a moment.
Yeah.
Um, and so I wanted to center the kind of other kinds of non-human existence and to think about making a future that's explicitly for them. The other thread that project brings in is that NASA and the space agencies always give these cute names to the rovers and the robots now,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they sometimes give them Twitter accounts, and they speak in the first person, and they talk about, oh, here's an update on my adventures, on the
Right.
surface of
Right.
Mars.
Yep.
So, and then they die, right? And everybody's sad again because we had this emotional relationship, with the artifact, with the technology,
Right.
right? This
Right.
is
Right.
again science and technology studies, how people think about their relationships with these bigger systems. So I was drawing and sketching, things like coming up with ideas for a space habitat that I might want to design. The human presence just gradually sort of faded away. At
Okay.
one point, I
Yeah.
had people like living in tents among these sort of more organized wilderness spaces.
Okay.
But the tents just disappeared, and I decided, you know what? No humans get to go at all. It's only cute animals and robots that get to go,
Amazing.
and we can
And
follow along with
manatees.
them via Twitter. We can follow along with them via TikTok. They could record videos. They can share their adventures with us. But the space is for them. It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
for us,
Yeah.
right? So that was a way for to think like really explicitly about who a future is for and how many deep interconnections we have with these other kinds of existence that are not really human at all. They are our companion species or our cyborgs, as again Donna Haraway might talk about.
Hmm.
They are important to any human future. I mean, I used to raise chickens, and the most populous sort of non-insect animal on the planet is the bird, right? Birds are the most common
Wow.
animal if you discount insects. The most common bird is the domestic chicken. So
It's
if
great.
we go to Mars, we humans go to Mars. If there is a if there ever is a bird on Mars, it will almost certainly be a chicken, a
Right.
domestic chicken, right? Chickens will be the first birds on Mars. And I think
Amazing.
that if you look at space history and speculative space futures through those lenses, a lot of fascinating things open up. Plus, I got to make all these renderings with like manatees floating
That's
in
what
space.
originally made me
And
click on it and then go. We went down the rabbit hole because of that. So good job for your illustration.
I just really love manatees. They remind me of the space shuttle. They're
Yeah.
kind of like a little bit goofy and ungainly, a little bit like strangely bulky in weird places.
Oh,
And you
that's
go
funny.
like, oh, why does it look like that? But they're engaging, right? Like the space shuttle is just instantly recognizable to any kid, even though no space shuttle has flown since like 2011.
Yeah, it's been a minute. Yeah,
It's
true.
still an icon, right? And we have this emotional relationship with it. So there was a resonance there, too, between sea creatures and ships and things like that. The way they move in weightless
Yeah.
environments is similar.
So that's great. So I guess finishing up with kind of the working group on adaptive systems, excuse me, and I'll put some links in, and maybe we put even like the manatee up and stuff. But I guess now that we're here and talking about this, I think you brought up something really interesting that I wanted to make sure. I guess we just plug in. The question is about scales. So I mean, a lot of interrelatedness in today's world is like just nested within scales, and it's just like, how deep do you want to go? Down the rabbit hole, down or up? It doesn't really matter. So one of the things you brought up that was pertinent to me, especially that goes with like urban planning, et cetera, is that now I've kind of come around to the idea, and this is not like some crazy thought, but like, nation states as it is today, or even the state system in the United States just really it's not really working anymore. And so one of the things that I've kind of really taken up as a personal cause or whatever to go forward is bioregional governance, and like how that is really, you know, the scale, if you will, of really a lot of decision making. Because you mentioned how do people in Baltimore get their water or their air, or, you know, it's and then and how things are historically situated from way back when. I mean, here in Los Angeles when I was there, like the pollution, you know, is mostly on black and brown people, and kind of that kind of in other cities too. It's not just Los Angeles, but like where pollution is and all this kind of stuff. So where do you have any thoughts on like scaling of sorts? And then anything else? I mean, I just threw in the bioregionalist because that's just kind of my thing. But I think something to be said about scaling or is, I think, pertinent to this kind of conversation. I don't know if you wanted to riff on that a little bit.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, I mean, one built into the name too, the working group on adaptive systems, is that idea of systems, and how systems become visible or legible or interactive with the people who are subject to them, or who design them, right? So it flows both ways, right? We try to change systems, we try to design systems from the ground up. Systems also change us, and systems also sort of co-design our set of possibilities and our set of possible worlds. And so making those things legible is something that I'm really interested in thinking about and reading about. You know, as I'm looking at my bookshelf over here, I've got Shannon Mattern's Code and Clay.
Oh yeah, sure.
You know, and she's one of many people who are really directly engaged in this question at the really macro level. Like, how do you make systems legible? And for me, one of the answers has been like something like the mascot, you know, which is also what the manatee and the space shuttle are. You know, they're kind of mascots for these big, super complicated, hard to understand, interconnected systems. In the case of the space shuttle, we tend to think of it as just this autonomous thing, like it can just go and fly to space whenever it wants and come back, right? But there's nothing that's more dependent than a spaceship, right? There's nothing that's more systems dependent than something like a spacecraft. And all that is sort of captured, but sort of also hidden by the figure of the shuttle itself, you know, as an icon, as a mascot. So that question of how do we make systems legible and more kind of interactive is something that's really, really fascinating. One of the other things that one of the other projects that I got to work on as part of the working group on adaptive systems was a scale model of the solar system, which was
really
so I got the chance to it was 1 to 2.8 billion. So the sun was an 18-inch sphere, and so I installed this. It stretched 1.5 miles through downtown Baltimore.
Oh, that's sick. I've seen a couple of those like out in the desert or other places. Yeah, but that's cool.
This was just temporary. Yeah, we see like YouTube videos go viral of like
100%.
you know, guys hop in a Jeep and they drive to Saturn, you know, or whatever. This was, you know, the 1.5 miles was a good scale because we could walk it. And during this festival, so I commissioned 9 artists to design the 9 planets, which is another kind of chance to just hand it over and to bring others on board and say, okay, well, what would you make? You know, you could do anything you want and call it Earth, but it should be about this big, and I should be able to mount it on this specific like mounting system that I designed. Other than that, make it whatever you want. And 2 of my former students collaborated to make Earth out of neodymium, rare earth magnet that is essential to things like cell phones and computers and solar panels. So they literally made like a rare earth.
Love it.
Fantastic. So, and this was during an arts festival that takes place regularly in Baltimore in the summertime. So it was a commission, you know, for a temporary limited installation. And but what was fun was I decided I'll lead walking tours of the solar system. So even, you know, some friends who were on the city council like joined, and you can make the systems of the solar system and the scale of the solar system legible in so many ways when you're occupying it with your body. You could say that we're walking at an average walking pace here as we go from, say, Mars to Jupiter. At an average walking pace, we're traveling at scale 13 times the speed of light.
Cool.
Which of course, it's impossible to move that fast based on the laws of physics. So it really puts it. You feel the solar system in your body, and even in a way, it feels funny describing it now because, of course, I'd seen all those YouTube videos and was aware, in Sweden they have one of these in a public park and things like that.
Yep.
But to have walked the solar system to have moved my body and other people and had these conversations from the sun all the way out to Pluto, I'll never forget the scale. So there's an embodiment, is another kind of way that I think, again, bringing back to concreteness, we're in a space, we have certain kinds of mobility abilities, right, to move through the space. What sort of understanding do we gain from being in this space and observing the materiality of a black rare earth?
Right.
So that's been another kind of a way to talk about big, usually invisible systems in a very concrete way.
No, that's super cool. And it reminds me, I'll have to maybe send you this off like later or something, but actually for Christmas a couple years ago, we got this thing that was like geological time. So it was a walking kind of podcast. So like you walk, say, for 3 hours, but through that you go through the time of Earth, in these scales. So very cool in those kind of ways of multimedia, but then scale. So very cool. But let's move on to I guess you could say space things and the main kind of topic of today's discussion. Last year you wrote a book for Verso Books, love their books, Space Forces, A Critical History of Life in Outer Space, quote, the radical history of space exploration from the Russian cosmists, to Elon Musk. So I guess, Fred, how can we really think critically about the history of life in outer space? I mean, I know that's a softball question, but I guess we can get into it deeper of that. First, like, how did you want to think about this? Why, again, life in outer space and not something else? And why maybe the title Space Forces? How much did you, do with that? So let's just get into that.
Yeah, I think again, going back to anthropology, I borrow quite often a concept from again Lisa Nasseri, the idea of a planetary imagination, and for Lisa, it's about thinking about planets that aren't Earth and how humans construct ideas about what they're like and how humans communicate to each other about what they might be like. I find it interesting to bring it back to Earth and say, okay, well, what sort of interpretation of our own planet, is embedded in these plans for future worlds away from Earth, right? Anytime someone is telling you that they want to make a new world in the future or a new world away from Earth, one question that's immediately really interesting to ask is, okay, what is important to you about a world in the first place? What is in a sense the essence of your your particular planetary imagination? And it turns out that space futures over the course of 150 years or so, which I date from as you said, the Russian cosmists, but also because that was the first moment where humans had the math to prove that this was possible.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Not only had the imagination, because of course humans have been thinking about living in space in all kinds of fantastical ways, but Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was more or less the first rocket scientist, was able to show mathematically that with energy resources available, we could launch something like a rocket into orbit. And hey, what does that mean for human futures in space? So it's tying the sense of what was desirable to the sense of what was possible for the first time. Every space future, and I examined 7 of them in detail in the book, all the way through this 150-year timeline. Every space future has embedded within it a kind of planetary imagination, and they often end up being very different planetary imaginations. So when you approach a body of material about a possible space future, whether that's a space future is put forward by, say, Jeff Bezos or Werner von Braun, or many of the figures that I look at, when you ask them, like, okay, what do you think a world is for and what's important to you about a world, you get very different answers.
Yeah.
And so that's the methodology of the book, and it really starts again with roots in again anthropology and STS.
And then, so I think also in some of the description is super interesting to see that, like, how much of speculative fiction, science fiction, those kind of things are not, like you're talking about planetary imaginations. It's not just like what's in textbooks, et cetera. What are kind of our imaginations about such? How did you really kind of thread the needle, I guess you could say, of like taking The interesting parts of, say, science fiction, because for me at least, I've seen maybe a resurgence in more like, I wouldn't say agnostic or not utopic, because usually science fiction is very dystopic, the cyberpunk, like telling us what not to do, I guess you could say. And
Mhm.
until I want to
Then
say, I
somebody
guess,
goes and does it anyway.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, it's like that meme of, scientists, it made that thing that they just said, the,
Right.
face eaters or whatever it was. But then science fiction is very interesting of like, so, it can change on its head with like the Arrival movie, or the short story with Ted Chiang that was
Mhm.
like super kind of interesting, or, the stuff with AI of usually it's Terminator style, but then you have other kind of depictions. So for me, I just wanted to really kind of see, as an author and a writer, like, how do you kind of bring those kind of interesting things in, but then also like ground them in the material reality that we were just talking about, of what there are certain value systems that maybe in certain countries go with certain sci-fi themes, and others go with others. So maybe how do you just think about that, and I guess putting the nonfiction and the fiction together, if you will, and making something of a book like this? Because I thought it was super interesting that you could be able to do that. But as an author and a writer, I also am interested in, well, how do you do that? Like,
Yeah, it's tough, right? I mean, that's the other side of the coin of like follow your own weird obsessions and turn them into academic research. Is like
yeah,
nobody would
nicely
want to.
done.
If I just wrote a book about here's all Fred's favorite, authors and movie makers, and here's why he thinks they're cool, like nobody would want to read that. That would
Yeah,
be a
yeah, yeah,
boring book. I wouldn't want to write that even.
yeah, yeah.
You've got to mobilize it in a way that fits into a bigger picture and is understandable to other people who aren't, neck deep in this stuff
Oh, sure. Yeah.
in the first place. And I mean, luckily, I mean, not luckily, but it turns out that again, that compartmentalization that we often take for granted doesn't really exist.
Mm-hmm.
That just like between just like borders that might, we might imagine between architecture and urban design and space, what I think of as spatial practices broadly, and science fiction, those borders are very porous and probably not really existent, in the first place in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found also was that borders between plausible futures, speculative futures, as put forth by people like Arthur C. Clarke um, and Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s. Borders between this sort of narrative of plausibility. Here's what your life will be like 50 years from now. I guarantee it. Science proves it. And and fiction, those borders are not existent really either.
Yeah.
That it really is this sort of cross connection. There are these constant conversations that go on between and across these different disciplines and these different ways of thinking. So it was important to me to make those connections explicit and to bring that conversation up to the surface and say, like, okay, who's reading who and who's in dialogue with who. Arthur C. Clarke is a person who moves seamlessly between these worlds.
Yeah.
He's working in plausibility, he's working in possibility. So that was one thing. Like it was a direct challenge to myself to make those connections, one, explicit, but two, like meaningful, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Again, and where meaning comes in for me, I think is exactly where you identify in the function of utopianism and dystopianism. Because to me, what I started to realize, of course, others have written about this as well, but what I started to realize is that if utopian or dystopian science fiction and speculative future as a general kind of way of thinking, fictionally or not, if that's doing its job right, it's functioning as a critique of the present, as a
Mm-hmm.
critique of a kind of existent planetary imagination that exists in practice today. And so, I think dystopia and utopia are, and of course, Frederick Jameson writes about this in some of his work on science fiction, among others, but I think they're the same type of thing. And I think that thing is a critical perspective on the present. It's not a blueprint for, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to,
Right.
you
Right.
know, take this stuff from the moon and it has this percent silica and this percent aluminum, and we can build windows out of the silica and structure out of the aluminum. That doesn't matter, right? What it's doing is critiquing, how something like how we use resources in
Yep.
general. Why do we look at the moon and we see, oh, how much aluminum and silica is in there? What can I do with it? Right? That's a planetary imagination. So science fiction generally, what its function in that loop is, one of its major functions in that conversation across disciplines, is to offer critiques of existent status quos that we take for granted. Like, hey, well, a planet is for me digging it up and taking it apart into stuff that I can use, right? That's a planetary imagination that deserves critique. And science fiction is where that critique happens, I think, most cogently.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty. Yeah, there's plenty of examples of that I could list off of that. But my follow-up question was some of those speculative futures and value kind of laden assessments and things. Is there anything that was kind of maybe left on the cutting room floor, or are there other kind of movements that maybe you're familiar with or want to talk about? I'm assuming at Morgan State there's maybe something to do with Afrofuturism, solar punk, lunar punk. Crypt space, which is super interesting. I didn't really know about. And then it kind of wowed me is the idea is that if you have kind of disabled bodies in space, well, but they are, directly, taking a step back, the astronauts lose their bone density a lot, like in space. And so some people are saying that, well, what if you put someone that already has low bone density in space, that, those kind of things and bodies in space. So don't know if you have any other kind of movements that you can kind of talk about that maybe are not in the book, or you want to specifically go into more of the book. But I think we need to kind of continue on the thread of the planetary imagination and world buildings, because it really is, how do we even, before policy and design and all that, is how we think about this, really. And so I don't know if you want to kind of take us a little bit more in depth with that.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's so much that made it, that ended up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It ended up being, paths that I think you start down and you go, oh wow, there's a whole set of things there that
sure.
that deserve to be engaged with more directly in a way that I don't have the space for right now.
Yeah.
And among those, I think was able to engage a little bit with questions of Afrofuturist speculations. One of the things that's fascinating for me about Sun Ra, as a kind of previous generation of Afrofuturist practitioner, is that when you go back to his primary texts, he was talking about moving all Black people off of Earth into another planet where white people wouldn't be allowed, which is a fascinating question, a fascinating speculation. That ties directly to concrete, spaces like HBCUs, and questions of who a space is for. Is spatial justice, is that a broad enough concept that it includes, the creation of a whole kind of separate planet for people who have been treated unjustly in the Black diaspora? It's a totally fascinating question, because it comes back to, I think, one of the things that people get excited about when they think about space is this idea of infinity, and this idea of a potential kind of hyper pluralism that goes along with access to, a lot of resources, access to a lot of energy, access to a lot of space. Space is big. How many types of existence are possible? The answer to that question might be very large, or it might be, it might end up being very small. So in many ways, the set of things that you bring up here about disability in space, about Afrofutures, they're about the shifting away from the idea that a white male able-bodied man, cisgender man, is a default subject. Which is really exciting and interesting. And for me, what goes back to, if there is like a set of ideas that captures what's interesting about that question, it exists, again, both the beginning and the end, or the current moment that we have here in terms of space history. At the beginning, when the Russian cosmonists were talking about having access to infinite amounts of space, room, and resources and energy, they wanted to just infinitely reproduce the past. We're going to resurrect every human who ever lived, make them immortal, and we're going to populate the solar system and the universe with every human who already lived. Right? There's this repetition of the past. There was a sort of a schism there in that movement, and in the early 20th century in Russia, where some people were saying like, well, no, we have access, we want to live forever, we want to go anywhere, right? Okay, with you in that part, but why can't we be anything we want to be? Why do we have to reproduce a past in this new possible future territory? So there's an argument to be made that there was a critique of cosmism that I identify with the term biocosmism, which was adding freedom of form and pluralistic, the possibility for infinitely pluralistic modes of existence to that freedom in time and freedom in terms of access to space. And that opens up a really interesting set of conversations and consequences.
Yeah.
At the other end of space history, I think, and again, I touched on this a little bit in the conclusion to my book, but I think there's probably a whole other world out there down this path that I'm starting to tread, maybe a little bit tentatively now, is, not what we think of as a speculative utopian critique of an existing status quo, usually international law. But it turns out international law embodies, many ideals that get left behind in concrete reality. So in documents like the Outer Space Treaty, and maybe more radically in the Moon Agreement, we find these legislative hints that kind of pluralism is also possible and even desirable, and a way to sort of resolve this contradiction, I think, that comes up about identity and difference.
Yeah.
The Outer Space Treaty, according to a generous reading, classifies anybody who goes into space as an astronaut. And it says that astronauts have certain rights and responsibilities to each other and to, the bigger picture of, other astronauts and other humans generally, other people. That you have to provide mutual aid if you're able to. You have to be able to share things, and you have to be able to help if you can, basically. Wow. Which is a really kind of exciting radical idea about how a body of people should organize themselves in the future and in space. So if we take the Outer Space Treaty at its word, it says that even though all kinds of existence are possible, what we share in space is that we share this identity of the astronaut. Mm-hmm. And we share these rights and responsibilities. So you might be a crippled astronaut, you might be a Black astronaut, you might be a post-human cyborg astronaut, right? But you are a person who is carrying on activities in space. You have these rights and responsibilities and these obligations to one another, which is a really exciting way to resolve this contradiction about who gets to go, what they should be doing there, and how they should relate to one another. So you have this possibility for this infinitely pluralistic existence, as long as we understand our obligations to each other and how we need to enact or embody and practice care in real material terms. You need air, I can offer air. You need calories, you're starving to death, I can offer calories. You're in a domestic violence situation, I can help, right? So there's a set of really exciting possibilities opened up, through, again, utopianism, but also, the seemingly boring stuff about treaties and law and material stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And how the one defines how the other should move around.
So, I mean, you basically did my job for me, in that I'm assuming this is coming a little bit too of your latest contribution, Space Codes, the Astronaut and the Architect, in the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Social Studies of Outer Space. Because I saw Alice Gorman, who is someone we will probably talk about, is editing that. And then when I was looking through it, I saw your name there and I was like, whoa, okay, he's in this as well. Okay, cool. So maybe, I mean, I don't know if you have other things that you want to riff on that, but I thought that as soon as I saw that, I needed to ask you about that.
Oh, totally. And that was a great opportunity that Alice presented to sort of think about the next steps for some of these concepts and how they might lead to something in the future. For me in that chapter, what I was trying to do was to inventory, was to do some boring work, to inventory sort of what sort of, right here, as a person who practices architecture, you have to adhere to all kinds of codes that govern what you're able to do, right? I mean, stairs have to be certain dimensions. Windows, if they're close to the ground, they should be made out of glass that won't injure me if I break it. All kinds of standards are built into the way the production of space is practiced. That is happening and will continue to happen in these territories off of Earth, right? And it happens at every scale. It happens at the scale of regional planning and where things should go and how they should be connected to one another. It happens at the scale of cities and settlements, and the way that how does transportation work? How do we separate the things that are dangerous from the places where we live? What is public space? How do we define what public space should be? And at the scale of the room, which we're talking about surfaces and the way the air is subject to code, right? The design of the air in the rooms that we're sitting in has certain regulations attached to. Certainly in the EU, where you are, the air is very heavily regulated, and that's a good thing. But also to the scale of the person. So a licensed architect has certain obligations to what was written in North America in North American law as the health, safety, and welfare of the public.
Mm.
So that means that a licensed architect should not endanger health, safety, or welfare of the public broadly defined, right? And that's an important bit of code because it captures, hey, architects shouldn't just, be tools of the profit motive of clients, right? Because if
Mm-hmm.
that's left to run roughshod over a public commons, then we won't get good
Oh, sure.
outcomes.
Yep, yep, yep.
So this obligation to the public acknowledges, certain things that could go wrong. And that when you again read the letter of the law closely and generously, and maybe as a way of enacting critical practice, right? The law itself is a utopian critical practice. If I'm a licensed architect and I walk into a space that is not up to code, I have even if I had nothing to do with the design of that space, according to one reading, and this is a contested reading, but according to one reading, I have an obligation to report that and help make that better.
Right.
Right. So the figure of the architect and the figure of the astronaut, I think, have this consonance there in
Oh,
terms of their responsibility to their fellow public, whether it's defined broadly as like the astronaut, as everyone in space, or the public, which is everyone in the city of Baltimore, say,
yeah.
and to take steps to help make things safer. So I get chills, when I think about health, safety, and welfare of the public, and the way that that is embodied, by the figure of the architect, and the way there is a rhyme there is a consonance there between the obligations and rights and responsibilities of the figure of the astronaut. So that's really what that article is about, and hopefully that is a roadmap for some future work as well.
Oh no, that's so cool. The juxtaposition of not just the astronaut and the architect, but combining them almost in this next thing that we're going to talk about is brick moon space and the idea of space architecture. So quote unquote, brick moon means better space habitats. Our unique perspective, grounded in the social sciences, and architectural design, allows us to ask different kinds of questions about your desired habitats and get useful answers. So cool. I don't know if you're familiar with Mars City Design and Vera Muljani. Are you familiar with them?
Oh no, I'll add that to my list though.
Yeah. So basically, I was an intern, 6 years ago for them, and we helped to do a Kickstarter. But they basically do a design contest of like Mars habitats, and so it's kind of a cool like little thing. And then also I did a analog Mars simulation mission with the Mars Society. So I was a crew
Terrific.
journalist and
Wow.
went and stayed there for like 2 weeks in southern Utah.
Utah.
It was crazy. Similar, Mars, whatever. It was a very cool experience. But anyway, so tell us about, space architecture and like kind of taking that architectural, I guess, grounding as we've kind of discussed and what that means, but then also, doing that in space of an architect being an astronaut architect, if you will, and then Brick Moon Space. How did it come about, et cetera?
Yeah, Brick Moon is a great chance to again work with others. In this case, others are Justin Walsh and Alan Scorman, aka Dr. Space Junk, who you mentioned earlier, who's a terrific colleague. They're both terrific colleagues, and it's been cool to collaborate with them a little bit on their International Space Station archaeological project.
Oh, right,
Which they've been doing for a couple of years now.
Yep.
That produces all kinds of crazy results, and we actually just last year we were able to co-design an experiment that was carried out by actual astronauts doing active archaeology on the space station for the first time.
Dope. Okay.
That was around this time last year. So coming out of that work, where I was able to collaborate a little bit with them, we had the chance to start talking with people who are designing things like space stations, next generation space habitats, and vehicles, the spaces that humans occupy. And what we started to find is that on the one hand, there's a lot of like there's not a lot of sort of integration of aspects of the human element that people steeped in archaeology and architecture can't ignore. Of course, there's a lot of data about how bodies, as bodies work, about bone loss and eyesight changes and things like that result from living in microgravity for a long period of time. It's super dangerous to bodies. It turns out, way more dangerous than anybody like Werner von Braun or people from the 50s ever suspected. But there's also questions about like, okay, well, how do people make culture together in a space, especially when they're coming from all kinds of different backgrounds? Right? Everybody's coming from a culture when they go up there. It's an international space station. But also the space itself makes a culture, right? We make our spaces and our spaces make us. So they're producing culture while they're there. So besides the data and the engineering concerns, that are usually captured by the term human factors in these conversations,
Yep.
there are all these cultural concerns too about how spaces make cultures and cultures make spaces. And what we wanted to be able to do was to do two things with Brick Moon, to be able to get away from the anecdote a little bit. A lot of the companies who design space habitats, they often have an advisor astronaut or advisor X astronaut, on their board, or that they have on speed dials a go-to consultant.
The clout is there, yeah.
The cloud is there, but also the personal stories are there,
For
right?
sure.
What was the most difficult thing about living in space? What was the most useful thing? What sort of opportunities do we have to improve next generation designs? It turns out when you ask for stories, you get a lot of stories. And that's a limited perspective that provides, especially if you're only talking to one or two astronauts. Yeah. With the International Space Station Archaeological Project, Justin and Alice have a lot of bigger picture data. It's the question of scale again. Who is actually using what space and when, and with who else in it? And so they can look at that over a 20-year window. Totally. That isn't captured by a story from Paolo Nespoli or whoever the astronaut consultant is. So there's that, and there's also, I think, in terms of my own practice and my own relationship with Justin and Alice and with Brick Moon, I realized really early on, despite having designed a space habitat for manatees and chickens, that I didn't really want to be a space architect. Just like I realized, like, okay, all right, I've done that. I've built walls and swept floors and poured concrete. I've drawn structures at all scales that got built. I've done that. I understand what I need to understand about that. I don't really want to design space habitats, for all the stuff I've read about. What I'm more interested in doing is being what I'm able to, be in these conversations, which is to be, someone who thinks a lot about the history and theory of something like space architecture or space urbanism. Which I found that a lot of people are designing these space habitats and they're doing a terrific job, and they have a lot of knowledge. But they're not talking a whole lot about the bigger picture, the history and theory, which we talk about quite a lot in the spatial practice disciplines that I'm familiar with. Yep. So I hope to bring that conversation, again, to the forefront, to talk about the whys along with the hows, and of course the whats in terms of the production of space on a cultural level and on a social level, which I found that, and talking with Alice and Justin especially, archaeologists are also quite good at doing, and they have these they talk about these things in many of the same ways that architects do, which is really fascinating. So Brick Moon is named after a late 19th century short story by Edward Everett Hale that was published in the Atlantic, and it's sort of the first story, the first science fiction about a space station and about what it's like to live on a space station. Mm-hmm. And this is right after the Civil War. And and it's a sort of just accidental circumstance that lands these people on this artifact in space, this moon made of brick. But what happens is he goes right to, okay, how they make their own culture up there and how they recognize a sort of a new possible relationship with the cultures that they're leaving behind on Earth. So Brick Moon for us captures a lot of things. It captures the nature of the construct, right? This is the material kind of reality that was built by humans, again,
Right.
But it also captures the idea that along with that materiality comes cultural and social concerns that were foregrounded, right back in the 19th century, and it should be, at the forefront of, again, and in those spaces where design decisions are being made about future spaces, the cultural and social concerns should be part of the things that are talked about in those spaces.
Of course. Super interesting. And like now it goes to obviously the next scale. It almost seems like, yes, individual space habitats are interesting and novel and whatnot, but then it really is like, well, how are you making almost like the space city? How are you urban designing kind of the surrounding aspects? And then also you mentioned earlier Shannon Mattern. I'm trying to get her on the podcast and scheduling with her because her book, a City is Not a Computer, kind of immediately piqued my interest. But yeah, so this is fascinating. I'll be able to link, a lot of this stuff in the show notes. But I guess the next to last question that I have for you, like, what are some of the, future projects we should, be looking out for? I mean, this can be in any of your kind of projects. I know that Alice is hosting a space science and context conference, I think next week, that I'll be kind of trying to go to and attending. So maybe that's, up your alley as well. But what are some other things you're kind of getting into moving forward into the future?
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to attending a conference in London coming up in March, called Disincarnate, which is a chance to sort of talk about speculative futures in a way that brings in people from the more literary world and the literary
Okay.
studies world.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited to learn things, from these other disciplines that I haven't really folded in too much more directly. I'll be we're as Brick Moon, we're hoping to host in the summertime a kind of workshop charrette. We already have commitments from some of the people who work, daily in designing next generation space habitats,
Oh, very cool.
committed. But we hope to get as many people from these different companies that are making these futures, together to talk about all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally.
And because I think one of the things that we hope will happen is that when you're talking about like culture and social life, you don't need to worry about violating a non-disclosure agreement or giving valuable information to a competitor. You can have somebody from Blue Origin and somebody from SpaceX, hopefully, in the same room, working on the same kind of ideas at a big picture level without having to worry about day-to-day competition. So that's and the lens that we're using is the idea of crew autonomy. So again, it's kind of for me, I like the term crew autonomy because it sounds kind of boring, but it actually, when you crack it open, it leads to all kinds of interesting questions about how these things happen in a way that isn't captured by data, anecdotes, or human factors.
Right.
And also, my own kind of interest in the figure of the astronaut is I hope captured by that. So we hope to have this workshop in California, in Southern California, around midsummer. I'm
Okay.
looking forward to that.
We'll see if I can
Um,
come back home.
oh yeah, if that's something you're interested
If it's
in
in LA,
attending,
for
I'd love to
sure.
give you more info about that.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk. I guess then the last question, and this is kind of something I talk with all guests about, is I'm assuming you're familiar with the overview effect and kind of the psychological
Mm-hmm.
happenings of what an astronaut goes through when they see the Earth from space. And I kind of always want to take this time as a last parting question to kind of just, do you have any thoughts? Like I sometimes ask people like what they would maybe say. Some people have said they'd, maybe read a poem or something, because just the grandeur of seeing the Earth from space. And there's only been like, 600 people and 10 million humans ever,
Right.
since the history of time that have been able to experience this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or want to say anything, or some people say like, no, I would just enjoy it. No, I would just look. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about the overview effect.
Well, I think I'm fascinated by the overview effect for a number of different reasons. I like that, methodology aside, I think there's some questions about maybe the scientific methodology of the study of the overview effect. He sort of Frank White,
Yep.
not really a trained scientist, which no shade there, neither am I. But he sort of had a conclusion before he collected data, and he was looking for data to support the conclusion, which is that's always a little bit questionable. But sort of everybody sort of does that. So I don't know. I mean, you as an STS person must have a lot to say about that.
I honestly, I've been thinking about it that I wanted to maybe go into maybe some STS stuff for my thesis about like the filmmaking. Like my girlfriend's a Steadicam operator,
Mm-hmm.
and that was invented in the late 70s. The Shining
Mm-hmm.
and Star Wars, et cetera. But then other things have kind of been popping up. It's like, wait, but you're really into this, and like the politics behind, say, the overview effect, or how it kind of started, and what
Mm-hmm.
people view is super interesting. And I may eventually research that a little bit more.
Yeah, and there's other people like Jordan Bim writes about the overview effect in a really critical way,
Yeah.
about how it is tied to certain kinds of identities and certain kinds of existence. But I like that Frank White says things like, "Hey, he sort of makes these utopian speculations and offers these sort of critical forays. So it's like, hey, shouldn't going to space be a human right? Shouldn't every this question, who gets to go? Well,
Yep.
Frank White's answer is that everybody should get to go, right? It should be a human right, which is like, I'm way behind the kind of utopian provocative aspects of that kind of assertion. And then The other the other thing that I think I love following that's really problematized the overview effect in recent news is that moment when Jeff Bezos sent Captain Kirk,
Oh, and
sent
he,
William Shatner up into
yeah,
space, hoping for this transcendent result.
yep,
And a couple of things. I mean,
love
basically,
it.
Shatner comes back and he says, "Space is a tomb. I was reminded of nothing but like our own fragility and mortality and death. There's nothing up there but death."
Yeah, yeah.
Just like it was probably not the result that Jeff Bezos was
Oh
hoping.
no, he was
Yet from
not.
Captain Kirk.
No, no, especially not what you were thinking of, and the anecdotes have been kind of along that vein. But I think I've kind of, at least, or I think in my head, started to become a little bit more critical of the overview effect and things. And it's like, for me, the overview effect was about, like, I guess you could say, that frontierism, like trying to get out and about. But then that is so heavily laden with, colonialism and all this other kind of stuff, and indigenous peoples and all that. And so for me now, it's like, not using the overview effect to continue looking out into the cosmos, because I think that's interesting. There's some to be said about robotic exploration of Europa, and eventually humans. Eventually, sure, whatever. But most of my thing is now flipped it in that the only reason why it's interesting that we go to space and experience the overview effect is to look back at Earth. You know what I mean? And like that's kind of been my switch. But yeah, it's a super interesting subject that I think a lot of people have a lot of thought provoking ideas and such. But
Well,
also,
what I like about the Captain Kirk story is that it doesn't matter what you think you're going to feel in advance, right? I mean, if anybody was
oh,
primed to
sure.
think about the final frontier, it'd be Captain Kirk, but it didn't quite work out that way,
No,
when
it
he
did
got
not.
there. So the anticipation, even if you're maximally primed to have a certain reaction to an experience, it doesn't mean that anything will come out the way you thought.
No
But
kidding.
I agree with what you're saying here. For me, it's connected to, again, the critical function of science fiction, utopian or dystopian science fiction especially, is that to critique something you have to gain a distance from it,
Yeah.
to sort of get a critical understanding of a system at scale like a planet. You have to sort of get distant from it in time or space, which is what science fiction does, but also I think what the overview effect does.
Well said. Well said. Well, I think that's all the kind of time we have today. So I think that wraps it up for us. But I just wanted to say thanks for coming on Conversations, Fred. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much, Nicholas, for the invitation. It was a great conversation, a lot of fun.
I really enjoyed that conversation with Fred Scharmen. Lots of great topics on important issues within the design and architecture field. We again thank Fred for coming on Conversations. Now, before we go, please like this video if you found the conversation interesting, leave a comment with your favorite part, and subscribe for more eclectic content. Until next time, ad astra.